Hello everybody, welcome to another Backrooms theory video on my channel. Today I wanted to take a look at a question that I think is incredibly important to the series, but one I haven't been able to really nail down or talk about in a real specific stance. And this is basically just a video about how I think the complex operates. This video is going to take a look at a multitude of different theories. I don't really have a specific one that I think is like the true theory. I have one that I think is more substantial than the other two, but I have no specific one in this video that I'm kind of saying this is what I think absolutely 100% is the answer. Why I think this is an important thing to look at is that Kane did say that there is a methodology that the complex uses to build itself out, that there's a reason why certain things are copied inside of it, and there's a reason why these things exist in the first place. So I think it's worth taking a look at and having kind of an open discussion type video about what that methodology could be. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So, let's begin with null zones. So we know null zones are how the complex pulls people into itself. We know from archive.tar that they are created by a electromagnetic null KX field being created within the complex. There's a lot of like deep science you could get into with this, which if you're really interested in that, I once again always recommend Red's channel. She does a very good job diving into the more physics of how the complex works. I don't understand that stuff, and I'm not going to try to understand it or pretend like I know what I'm talking about with that. So I want to talk about this more conceptually rather than delving into science that I'm not an expert in. Basically, null zones act as a gateway for items and people to enter the complex, but I don't think this is their only purpose. I think null zones also act like a window for the complex to see into the real world. This user on TikTok by the name of Dogbruh had a very interesting theory about how null zones work in this way, and I thought it was so cool that it really kind of gave me the inspiration to make this part of the video. So credit to him for coming up with this. As far as I know, he's the only person I've seen say this, but he posited that null zones act like pinholes. Now, I'm going to try to explain this as best as I can, but I don't want to get, again, too deep into like science of this stuff. Pinholes work really by focusing light by restricting vision and blocking out peripheral light rays. He makes the claim that this is how the null zones copy people and items from standard. This also kind of plays into the homothet theory. Homothet is a track that plays in the film when Captain Clark kills Clark. And homothet is a term in geometry that refers to objects being shrunk or enlarged. Now, in Dogbruh's theory, he says that null zones are like pinholes and that proximity to them could inform how an object or a person is enlarged or shrunk. He points this out by using Clark and the bearded still life as a reference. Since Clark spends all his time in his store near the null zone in the movie, it distorts his still life to make him massive, while the bearded still life is farther away from a null zone, so he's like more relatively normal in size. This ties into the idea that I had and multiple other people had that a proximity to the null zone is how someone is remembered by the complex, and how that informs the accuracy in which somebody is remembered. Back in my movie theory video, I said that I thought Captain Clark was a more accurate representation of Clark himself, and had the ability to bleed and feel pain, unlike other still lives, because Clark in standard had spent so much time near a null zone. Therefore, the window was consistently open, and he was consistently in the complex's sight. This whole homothet theory could be the reason why we see enlarged and small objects, dining room chairs in found footage 2, and the signs in Everything Must Go. Speaking of Everything Must Go, if you have not seen it yet, Kane recently uploaded it to his YouTube channel, so the previously theater-only bonus footage is now available for everyone to watch on Kane's channel. I also wanted to make a quick note right here and a correction to something I said in the Backrooms timeline video. Initially in the Backrooms timeline video, since that video was made directly after the movie came out, I had assumed that Clark had killed Kat in the complex. This was incorrect. I now believe that she was either killed by Captain Clark or she killed herself or something else happened because of what Kane said on the director's commentary on the Blu-ray. On that, he makes a claim saying that the reason why Clark was keeping Kat's head in the fridge was more so out of hope that Kat would be remembered by the complex and recreated or brought back in some way. So this could add more credence to the idea that the complex remembers things based off of who's been inside it, which is an idea we will get to later. I just wanted to make that quick correction right now, since we're talking about things related to the movie. Another idea that can be raised by the pinhole theory is that since pinholes work by blocking out peripheral light rays, that maybe this is the reason why the green light exists in the complex. The green light is how the complex generates new areas. We've seen this so far in Found Footage 2 and Pitfalls, and briefly in other videos as well, including Overflow and Found Footage 3. The idea here would be that since the green light is part of the visible light spectrum, that maybe the complex can only perceive that part of the visible light spectrum. Again, I'm not super solid on the science of this stuff. That's not really my thing, but it's just an idea. This also maybe could explain why outdoor areas of the complex are bathed in red light. Maybe that is the only part of the visible light spectrum that the complex can perceive with outdoor areas, and therefore that's why they're red. Again, there could be a more deep science dive into this from somebody else that is way more adept at science than I am. Now, this whole idea of null zones being windows into the complex and responsible for copying items and still lives does beg the question, why haven't we seen a still life of an async employee in the hazmat suit? And if this theory is holding, it would make sense that we would see this since they spend all their time in the complex and near a huge null zone like the Threshold. First off, we may have seen an async still life on the cover of the vinyl. We're not still 100% sure that's exactly what this is, but it looks like that's what it is. But I think another reason could be that the Threshold is so stable that the complex doesn't even consider it to be a null zone. It's just like a constantly open door. So the idea that null zones are windows or pinholes that the complex uses to see into the real world could explain how still lives are made and why a place like Clark's store is remembered by the complex so well. The null zone in Clark's basement is completely stable. It's open longer than other null zones have seen to be open. So we can relatively assume here that the longer a null zone remains open, that the longer the complex has an open window into the store to copy it. This again could also explain the green and red lights visible in the complex. It's entirely possible that the complex, because it's operating like a pinhole, is blocking out the other visible light rays, letting only green and red light in. So that's really the crux of my first theory, that null zones are windows that the complex can look into standard and copy different things from, and that they work like pinholes, as Dogbru's video pointed out. But there are other theories that I think we need to consider when talking about how the complex works. The next idea I want to introduce here is that the complex works with some sort of collective consciousness to pull from people's memories. The memory theory has been kind of debunked at this point. I think that there's still some element of it or a collective consciousness that the complex operates from. The reason I say that this might have been debunked is that Kane said in interviews for the movie that the complex is not reading people's minds and pulling out places it thinks are important. I think it's important to note that in that statement, Kane included the stipulation that the complex doesn't know what's important to people. There could still be some sort of memory component to how the complex operates, maybe not so much it reading people's minds, but pulling from a collective consciousness. The evidence for this really comes from the movie, since it's the best example we have of people running into spaces that they recognize inside the complex. I think there really has to be some discernible reason for why Mary's house, her office, and Kat and Bobby's apartment are remembered in the complex. We see all of these in the montage at the end of the film. First off, personally, I do not believe that there is a null zone that shows up in each of these locations that the complex then uses as the window to pull from. This theory can kind of work in concert with the previous theory. They can kind of work together here. I just think that there might be multiple different ways in which the complex can remember something or copy it. That being through null zones, i.e. the open window, and through this theory of a collective consciousness or a memory. The chances of null zones appearing in all of these areas, like Mary's office and Kat and Bobby's apartment, that are important or relevant to characters from the movie is incredibly low. We've only seen a handful of null zones appear in the series so far, and I still think it would be very strange if they were common. They should be rare. Another thing that makes me think that this could be pulled from some sort of memory is the fact that these spaces are all related to people who have spent time in the complex. Mary, Kat, and Bobby have all spent an expanded period of time actually physically inside this place. So if the complex does pull from their consciousness, it would make sense that these spaces would be replicated because they spent time in these places right before entering the complex. Mary gets a phone call at her house, which is also her office, that leads her to Captain Clark's Ottoman Empire and then into the complex. Mary's bed is even remembered in the exact same state it was before she leaves to go to Clark's store. Now, it could be that the complex is pulling from some things that Clark has seen rather than Kat, Bobby, and Mary. I say this because a little detail I noticed is when Clark goes to Kat and Bobby's apartment to recruit them to research the complex, this door here is open, and it's also open in the complex remembered version of their apartment. Again, I think it would be incredibly unlikely that null zones would appear in all of these areas. They're too specific to all the characters we've seen and talked about, and there's too many of them. There's definitely one in Clark's store, and definitely one in his parking lot because of the seagull that falls in at the beginning of the film when we see Naren's found footage. That could explain his store being copied, and his store being copied multiple times. It can also explain the McKee road sign we see in the pool room area. Clark's store is located on the intersection of Capitol and McKee, as well as the area of the strip mall that we see remembered at the end of the film that is connected to his store. But all these other personal spaces to Kat and Bobby and Mary, as well as Mary's childhood home, don't really have a good explanation. And again, I think it's a little bit unlikely that a null zone would appear in all of these areas, considering that they are supposed to be rare. And it would be a pretty big coincidence that all of these characters that experience these things in the complex would have something remembered to them that's so personal because a null zone just happened to appear there. There's one more theory that I want to share today that could work totally on its own, disconnected from these other two theories. All three of these theories could work together, or this theory could just work alone with the memory theory or with the open window theory. Again, this video is very open-ended. The last idea that I have here is that the complex is just copying literally everything in the world. This would kind of follow up the idea that was introduced in I Remember, which is you have always been here. This idea that you are constantly in the complex because the complex is everything. So if that quote does mean what we think it means, that the complex is just everywhere and copying literally everything, that it's not really special where a null zone appears, and the complex is just kind of doing it piecemeal, like just copying the whole world piece by piece with these windows one at a time before it has the entire world inside of it. There's a lot of evidence in the series so far that the complex is merging with reality. So first off, we have Clark's breaker box in the movie, with those additional switches on the bottom that were not there before. There's also Ravi's house in Found Footage 3 that has an entirely new hallway in the basement that was not there before. There's also a little moment in the OST mashup where we see two circles coming closer together before one totally absorbs the other. This could be a representation of the complex literally absorbing Standard. In my Out of Sync video, I talked about some disaster that happens at Async that likely destroys the building, and this huge climactic event of the complex and Standard crashing into one another could actually be that climactic ending to the series. I don't think this theory decanonizes or gets in the way of that null zone window theory. I think it makes a lot of sense that those ideas can coexist. I also want to take this video to disprove the idea that Captain Clark was created when Clark fell in a chair in his store while recording that ad with Bobby and Kat. That cannot possibly be true because we know Captain Clark is active in the complex by at least June 19th, when the end of Everything Must Go happens and the beginning of the Backrooms movie happens, where we see him attack Bill, Ronald, and Naren and eventually kill Naren. I think Captain Clark was created sometime when Clark put on the outfit to do one of his ads. The reason why Captain Clark is hostile, and the reason why it is a much better copy of Clark, is for the exact same reasons that I listed in my movie video. That being that Clark is consistently angry and upset when he's inside his store, and the complex would remember how he was feeling while he was wearing that outfit in trying to basically clone him and recreate him as a still life. And there we have Clark being a very hostile and angry still life inside that costume that he hates wearing. Also, there's no way that he was created in the moment that he fell in the chair, not only because of the date discrepancy, since that happens after Naren is killed and we see Captain Clark at the complex, but if he was to be created in that moment, we see the complex remembering that in the throne room, and there's no way Captain Clark could have gotten out of this room. Clark has to crawl through a small hole to even get in it, and he has to crawl through a small hole to get out of it. So there's no way Captain Clark could have done that given his tall frame. That's just something I've seen said a lot, and I wanted to just get that out of the way, because there's no way that that's a true theory and that actually could possibly exist. So I just wanted to take this moment to dispel that. Clark's basement absolutely holds a null zone and has held a null zone for far longer than Clark is even aware of, and that we are aware of as the audience. So would have ample time to replicate Clark in that costume, and that stability of his null zone has to be the reason why there are so many versions of his store remembered in the complex, and why the version that Mary runs into at the end is remembered almost perfectly. Now again, this theory can stay on its own, and it could work in concert with the other ones. I still think there has to be some form of memory theory going on here, or some sort of collective consciousness, considering the fact that I highly doubt that Mary interacted with a null zone before entering the complex in Clark's store, because null zones in and of themselves are supposed to be rare. They're not supposed to show up wherever, at least as far as we know. We've only seen a handful show up so far in the series, and I think it'd be incredibly unlikely that she stumbled across one before this. This begs the question then, why is she remembered as a still life at the end of the movie? Well, the only logical explanation I can think of, and the one that makes the most sense, is that the complex remembers her, not even just being near it, but interacting with it and actually passing through it, then has the complex remember her because she's been inside of it. If this is the case, then it's likely that there's a Ravi still life out there, a Madison still life, a Kane still life, and as we've already discussed in this video, multiple still lives of async workers in their hazmat suits just about somewhere in the complex. I think the null zones being windows theory is pretty solid, and I think that that's probably the best guess we have about how null zones actually work in relation to the complex copying geometry. I think that homothet idea is pretty close to accurate. I think that is the best representation I've seen of it, but I still think that there is some evidence that suggests that some places are pulled from people that have interacted with a complex by being inside the complex and interacting with it. This could also explain why Mary is remembered as a still life at the end of the movie in that moment with Phil. Either the complex actually does use the threshold as a null zone and as a window to copy geometry because she spent time inside of it. Let me know what you guys think of these theories. Again, I don't really have a specific one that I think is absolute. I think the windows idea is very good. I think the pinhole idea is very good, and I think it is possible that it is just random. Randomness is in of itself a methodology. But yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'm excited to read what you guys have ideas about with this, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks.